This video is brought to you by John Robson Guitar Tuition. If you enjoy the content, please consider supporting the channel by enrolling on a course, purchasing some guitar lessons or a t-shirt, or you can join my Patreon. Now, on with the show. Hello chaps, welcome once again to John Robson Guitar Tuition. As always, I do hope you're well. It's Tuesday, which means we're doing a top 5 list, or more accurately, we're doing part 2 of a top 10 list. Part 1 was last week. If you missed that video, it's linked down in the description. And the top 10 in question is, I'm basically sort of thinking out loud really about what are the 10 most important electric guitars ever made. And last week we looked at, well, I tell you what, go and watch the video. I won't spoil it, but we looked at 5 of the most important electric guitars ever made, and this week we're looking at another 5. So let's get straight into it with
the rock and roll revolution and beyond.
So if we're talking about guitars which had a massive cultural impact and or revolutionised the guitar industry, we have to think about what were the musical revolutions of the 20th century. There are a few, but one is undoubtedly head and shoulders above any other. Frankly, we can talk about a time before rock and roll and a time after rock and roll. Lemmy famously was quoted by Dave Grohl, I think, saying, "I remember before rock and roll." You know, so there's a hard line that, you know, you go back before that time and the world was different. So for all the fact that Fender made the Stratocaster and the Telecaster, and they were adopted by some rock and rollers, most notably someone like Buddy Holly playing a Strat, and you know, James Burton with Ricky Nelson playing a Telecaster, they didn't make that big an impact on 50s rock and roll. You think of 50s rock and roll guitar and you're probably going to think of Eddie Cochran playing a Gretsch 6120, or you may be thinking of Scotty Moore playing a Gibson ES295, or perhaps you're thinking of Duane Eddy also playing a Gretsch 6120, or perhaps Chuck Berry playing a Gibson ES355. What do all of those guitars have in common? They are made of wood with a fair contingent of fresh air inside it. Okay, they're either hollow or semi-hollow, and that, for me, is one of the characteristics of, you know, 50s rock and roll guitar, 50s rock and roll, the revolution that essentially changed the world. And it's that final guitar we're going to look at, or a variant on it, the Gibson ES335. Chuck played a 355, but essentially that's, to all intents and purposes, just a more ornate bells and whistles version of this guitar that you can see here. The thing is, we've gone from hollow-bodied electric guitars, which fed back and howling feedback and horrible kind of shenanigans like that, to solid-bodied electric guitars, which were immune to the problem. But there were some players who thought, well, yes, but we like the sound of the hollow guitar. Can we get a hollow guitar that doesn't feed back? And under the stewardship of Ted McCarty, almost forgot his name there, at Gibson, they basically came up with the idea of how about a guitar that's solid enough to not feed back, but hollow enough to still sound quite like a hollow-bodied guitar. And that Gibson ES335 was born. And for me, this is one of the most important guitars in the 20th century of the history of the electric guitar. You know, you can pick up one of these guitars and play the solo from Johnny B. Goode on it, but you can also play the solo from Kid Charlemagne on it. You know, and those solos are worlds apart. Let's not mince words here. You know, in terms of versatility, I think the 335 is up there with the Stratocaster. It's arguably one of the most important voices, or a 355 at least, which is basically the same guitar as this, is one of the most important voices in one of the most important musical revolutions of the 20th century. And, you know, it also revolutionized the industry. You know, every guitar manufacturer, every electric guitar manufacturer has had a stab at making a guitar which is copying this blueprint. Even, you know, Fender got in on the act when they made, you know, the Starcaster. Ibanez, Washburn, PRS, every company has had a go at making their spin on the Gibson ES335 formula of a solid centre block and hollow cavities on the sides of the body to give it the best of both worlds sound. And, for me, if we're thinking about the sound of the 50s, the rock and roll revolution, this guitar for me is... And its other contributions in the hands of people like Larry Carlton and Alex Lifeson and whoever. This guitar is one that has to be on the list. Let's see what's next.
The sound of the 60s.
As the 1950s drew to a close, rock and roll was running out of steam, it has to be said. Elvis was just coming out of the army and heading off to Hollywood to make a decade's worth of awful movies. Chuck Berry was in prison, Jerry Lee Lewis was in disgrace, Little Richard had gone back to the church, and we'd lost Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, Eddie Cochran, the Big Bopper. Sadly, they all passed away. So what sort of stewardship was rock and roll under? Well, it fell to the likes of Pat Boone. Have you ever heard his version of Tutti Frutti? Dear me. Anyway, what music needed at that point was a right royal kick up the backside, and it got it in the shape of a band from the UK who essentially took the romantic songwriting traditions of Irving Berlin, Cole Porter, Rodgers and Hart, etc., and just repackaged them with electric guitars at the forefront. I am, of course, referring to the Beatles. And the sound that defined the Beatles, and certainly that became the sound of what many people call Merseybeat or the British Invasion sound, is the sound of this guitar. Here's John Lennon on the Ed Sullivan Show playing a Rickenbacker 325 Capri. If you're recording a piece of music and you want to make it sound quintessentially 60s, just record it with one of these guitars. That jangly kind of 60s sort of tone. It is the definition, I think, of a 60s guitar tone, and, was at the forefront of another big revolution in music. It influenced countless other guitar players, Roger McGuinn from the Byrds springs to mind, although didn't he go for the, wasn't his the 330, the 12-string model? Anyway. The Rickenbacker sound is, for me, the sound of that 60s revolution in music, the British Invasion, the Merseybeat, and it influenced, so many aspects of our culture. I wouldn't say this is a guitar which revolutionized the guitar industry, though. Les Pauls, the Gibson Les Paul, rather, how many manufacturers have made copies of that? Same with the Strat, same with the Tele, same with the 335. You don't get too many companies, doing their version of a Rickenbacker style guitar. Just a thought. But it is, even if it didn't revolutionize the guitar industry, it certainly was a massive part of a big cultural phenomenon in the world of music, and that's why it had to be on the list. Let's see where we go next.
The grassroots revolution.
And so into the 70s. Let's say the late 70s is where our story moves us to now. Throughout the 1970s, the electric guitar was largely the voice of rock music, and rock musicians were quite happy rubbing along with, Stratocasters, Telecasters, 335s and Les Pauls for the most part, and played them pretty much as they came out of the factory. But by the late 70s, players were wanting more. They started modifying their guitars. This is where the grassroots revolution comes in. All of the other guitars that we've looked at have been thought up by inventors who either started a guitar company or, took their idea to a guitar company. But by the late 70s, players were wanting more from their guitars. They were wanting something that was comfortable and ergonomic, like a Stratocaster, but had Gibson-style pickups, humbuckers, and a tremolo system that would take some heavy use and abuse without knocking the guitar out of tune, and, some rather wacky-looking, ostentatious paint jobs, and this is probably best typified by this guitar here, Eddie Van Halen with his Frankenstrat. Basically, a bits and pieces guitar that he put together, and, it had many, if not all, of the attributes that I've just mentioned. And this, in the hands of Eddie Van Halen, spawned a revolution. People were basically modifying Stratocasters, putting humbucking pickups in them. Enterprising companies came up with, like Floyd Rose and Carl came up with tremolo systems that, whilst not my cup of tea, did answer the needs of the dive bombing players of the time. And, it wasn't long before this kind of modified, chop and change culture started, kind of finding its way into, regular production runs. Obviously, if we think of 80s guitars, 80s super Strat style guitars, then one company is pretty much synonymous with it. Yes, Jackson and Charvel were big players, but for me, the big name is Ibanez, with their RG550 that you can see here, which, got like a monkey grip handle in the form of the Steve Vai Gem guitars, and even Fender responded to this with their hot-rodded factory-made Stratocaster, the Fender HM Strat. I had one of these that looked identical to this. Yes, indeed. Even I bought into the whole Super Strat, locking tremolo, lurid pink and Dayglow colour revolution of the time. These guitars from, let's say, the first Van Halen album in 78 throughout the whole of the 80s till, really speaking, when grunge came along in the early 90s, this is what you thought of as an electric guitar. It certainly redefined the electric guitar. I remember reading a letter in Guitarist magazine, I think it was, in about 1986. So we're kind of right in the peak of this Super Strat, humbucker single, Floyd Rose kind of era, when somebody had written into the magazine saying that, the Stratocaster as a guitar is now obsolete. It has evolved beyond the three single coil with a non-locking tremolo kind of guitar. Why would anybody buy just a regular Stratocaster when for roughly the same kind of money you can buy, an Ibanez, which one did we see? That one there. You can buy a guitar that'll do everything a Stratocaster will do and more. And that was a commonly held, point of view back in those days. That guitar that you've just seen there was the evolution of what the Strat was destined to become, and why would we take an evolutionary step backwards and go back to playing, other Strat, kind of an earlier incarnation of the Strat style guitar? Well, turns out many of us liked the earlier incarnation, but if we're talking about guitars which had a massive impact, if it wasn't for players wanting that kind of dive bombing trem capability and humbucker sounds out of a Strat, and people like Eddie Van Halen and doubtless others as well, modifying Fender Stratocasters to try and get these results out of it, then we wouldn't have had the music that the 80s gave us. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? But nevertheless, it did shape the culture, the popular culture of the time. And, nowadays you still get guitars that follow that blueprint, and they are big sellers. And it all happened because of a grassroots revolution of guitarists tinkering and modifying and, upgrading their instruments at home. So that's why this had to be on the list. Let's see what's next.
Hair metal plus grunge equals...
By the late 1980s, the whole era of hair metal, glam metal and shredding instrumental virtuoso guitar players was drawing to a close, but we didn't know that back then. To many in the guitar business and the guitar industry, the kind of players who typified that genre were still the big business end of the market, which is why, I suppose, a company like Ibanez were willing to sink a lot of resources into, frankly, what was only ever going to be, realistically, you would have thought, a niche model. I am, of course, talking about this chap, Steve Vai, with his Universe 7-string signature guitar. He used this guitar on the Passion and Warfare album, and I think maybe, whatever his follow-up album was for that. I do apologise, I'm not that well versed. But by the couple of years after he'd sort of, appeared in all the adverts encouraging everybody, buy one of these, kids, even he'd gone back to, most of the time using 6 strings like, the rest of us were. So this was seen as a bit of a curiosity, a little bit of a, perhaps a hangover from the excesses of the hair metal days of the 80s, which were largely over by now, replaced with the new flavour of the month in the early 90s. We're talking about the sort of Seattle grunge scene, but that style of music had one important factor to it. It featured a lot of the time drop tunings. And these drop tunings kind of went beyond grunge and made their way into, grunge crossover, grunge metal crossover bands, new metal, etc. You'll have to forgive me, this is unfamiliar territory for me, and I know that some metal fans, especially these niche metal genres, it can get a little bit like that scene at the beginning of Monty Python's Life of Brian, are you the Judean People's Front? And you get the same sort of response. So excuse me if I commit any metal faux pas. But basically you had metal bands emerging that had taken on some grunge influences like the drop tunings. I'm thinking of maybe a band like Korn, for example. And, the idea that you could get a guitar with an extra low B string, that offered even more opportunities for, even lower drop tunings. And, of course, where Korn led, other bands like Periphery followed, and the 7-string became a staple of a different type of metal. Certainly not the kind of music that Steve Vai envisaged when he went to Ibanez and said, can I have a guitar with an extra string on it, please? These guys like Korn and Periphery and a whole host of other bands, I guess, they weren't making albums that sounded remotely like Steve Vai's Passion and Warfare. They were using that low string to add extra heft and weight and punch you in the guts, drop tuning kind of sounds to, the heaviest or heavier music that they were producing. So this one guitar here did sort of accidentally cause a revolution in the industry. We no longer now assume that because it's a guitar, it has to have 6 strings. It can have 7 or even more these days. Not my cup of tea, it has to be said. But then again, I'm just a crusty old blues dinosaur. So what would I know? What would you expect from me? So there you go. That is the what you get when you cross hair metal with grunge. Let's see where we go next.
The budget revolution. Bye-bye, Ply.
The late 1980s and early 90s were a pretty miserable time if you were an electric guitarist on a tight budget. In 1987, this guitar-shaped object, known as a Marlin Sidewinder, was the best-selling electric guitar in the UK, and I played several of these. When I first started teaching in 91, these guitars were still quite commonplace and, people had them, basically. And invariably, they had a tremolo system, that infamous KKT locking tremolo system, that wouldn't stay in tune. Lumpy feeling tuners, uneven, poor fretwork with sharp edges, and just everything that should have been smooth was rough-edged, and it wasn't a pleasant playing experience at all. And the sound of it was pretty much what you'd expect. It was not a pleasant guitar. As the 90s drew on, we got this slightly more respectable looking Strat copy, the Encore E76. And again, I came across many of these woolly, muddy sounding pickups, again, poor fretwork, sharp edges, bad tuning stability, not a great guitar. You could spend as much money as you wanted on mods and upgrades to this guitar, and you would always be chucking good money after bad. Then, the Squier Strat, which had sort of improved matters for the budget electric guitarist in the early 80s. Squier Strat from that period is a very great guitar and, much sought after. But by 89, like this example here, you can see once again, plywood is the timber of choice, as is the case for the other two examples. And then, in about 1993, we started seeing this advert usually on the back page, full page spread of Guitarist magazine. And the message was clear. You can either spend your 200 quid on the guitar at the top of the picture. It's not mentioned, but it is quite obviously a Squier Strat. And you can see it's made from plywood. Or you can spend the same amount of money on the guitar on the bottom of the picture, which, as you can see, is made from, solid timber, alder, I think it is. And of course, that is the Yamaha Pacifica 112. Pretty much overnight, this guitar revolutionized the budget guitar end of the market. No longer was it acceptable for a manufacturer to basically charge you 200 quid for a lump of plywood. There are other examples I can think of as well. The Epiphone by Gibson, Strat and Telecaster copies, plywood. That was just the default timber that the industry was using for sub £200 guitars, or even maybe a little bit over. Until this guitar came along. The reason why you can buy a Squier Bullet guitar these days, or a Harley Benton, or, that Glary that you can see behind me there, and the fact it will be made not from plywood, but from solid timber, and it's not just a tone thing. I mean, whether you're into the whole kind of tone wood argument or not, there's the fact that plywood will, under certain conditions begin to delaminate, and it's not particularly stable, is the point I'm making. The fact that you can buy a guitar for 200 quid or 100 quid or less, and it's made from, proper real wood. It's not made from wood in the same way as a hot dog is made from meat, is what I'm saying. Is largely due, I would say, to this guitar you can see on screen right now, the Yamaha Pacifica 112. I have a variant of it you can see on the wall behind me, that Pacifica 311H. 300 quid's worth of absolutely fantastic guitar. That is a professional instrument. And 300 quid in the year 2022 is, I would say, less in real terms than 200 quid was in, 1991. It's got to be. But yet, you can now buy a proper pro quality instrument for that sort of money. And, if we're talking about guitars which utterly revolutionized the industry, then I think the Pacifica 112 from Yamaha deserves a place on that list. So there you go. Those are the final 5 in what I would consider to be the 10 most important electric guitars ever made. Let me know if you disagree. Let me know if you have any other candidates that should have been on the list and what your reasons are for choosing those. But that is pretty much the video for today, folks. Hope you've found this and part 1 of this little exploration reasonably entertaining. And if that's the case, please hit the subscribe button and the notification bell if you haven't already done so. And why not give me a like while you're at it? Don't forget the live stream every Friday, 5 p.m. UK time. We drink beer and talk about stuff, usually guitar and music related, but the conversation can and usually does go anywhere. And that is, as I say, all I've got for you today. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for your time. Look after yourselves, folks. Stay well, stay safe, and above all, stay sane. Bye for now.